It's a hot topic, the idea of the legal implications, to a certain regard, of posthumous casts. And really the questions for me in thinking about the assembly of this panel, consisting of an art lawyer, an art historian, and an art historian / foundation representative, is who stands to gain from posthumous cast? It's kind of the elephant in the room. Of course, it's not the artist, because the artist is dead. So it really is the people who make money off of posthumous casts, and the people who have investment in posthumous casts, certainly. Now, I'm coming from formerly a market perspective, so this is something that I think about quite often. And there are a lot of pitfalls in posthumous casts, as we know, and oftentimes, as you'll see from our panelists, there are hesitancies in making that distinction that the artist is not immediately benefiting from a posthumous cast, because of the legal ramifications of doing such. So without further ado, I'm going to let our panelists take it over, and I believe the first up is Judith Bouchardeau, our lawyer.
So one of the legal issues surrounding the posthumous casts is their status. In terms of authenticity and originality, it is somehow difficult to qualify posthumous cast. We've seen all this, the work done by the Fondation Salvador Dali. So, under French law, the terms are, and the question is, are they reproductions or copies, or are they originals or authentic artworks? In a famous case concerning the posthumous casting of Camille Claudel's La Vague, French jurisdictions have tried to give some keys to this complex issue. So what are the facts of La Vague? La Vague is a sculpture realized by Camille Claudel between 1897 and probably 93. Camille Claudel died in 1943. She left no children, but various great-nieces and great-nephews. One of them, Reine Marie Paris, dedicated her life to the rediscovery of her aunt, whose work remained forgotten for almost 50 years after her death. In 1988, Reine Marie Paris casted some bronzes from a surmoulage of La Vague. There is one single copy of La Vague that is kept at the Musée Rodin. It represents a wave in onyx about to swallow a group of 3 bronze women holding hands on a marble basis. So you have 3 materials: the onyx, the bronze, and the marble for the base. The judicial saga of La Vague started in 1999 when the bronze cast made by Reine Marie Paris, numbered 3 out of 8, was exposed and sold, presented as an original, and accompanied with a certificate of authenticity drawn up by Reine Marie Paris herself, certifying that the work was an original. The other heirs of Camille Claudel requested the seizure of the bronze for counterfeiting, arguing that it could not be presented as an original without infringing the moral right of the artist. So this court case raises many issues. We will focus on one. Can a posthumous cast obtained from a surmoulage be presented as an original work? I apologize for the lack of suspense, but the court said no. And this is one of the very clear inputs of this court case. The Supreme Court, the Cour de Cassation in French, said a surmoulage cannot be called an original. However, if this decision clarified a situation concerning the posthumous casting obtained from a surmoulage, it left open the status of posthumous cast obtained from an original plaster or a terracotta, that is the cast, the bronze cast, obtained from an original mold of the artist. So we will therefore analyze first the answer given by the court concerning the case of posthumous cast obtained from surmoulage, and see, as a second step, what answer can be given to posthumous cast obtained from a plaster or a terracotta, the answer given by French jurisdiction. To try to give this answer, to see how French jurisdiction have answered this issue, we have to go back to the law and to the definition of an original artwork. When the work is realized by the artist himself, when it is shaped by his hand, when we talk about a painting or a carved marble, there is no doubt on the original character of the work. In the case of multiples, it is a more complicated issue, especially when the work is not realized by the hand of the artist. It is interesting to see that it became necessary to give a legal definition of what is an original artwork in the case of multiples to respond to commercial matters on the art market. In France, we have two sets of rules that have been adopted. In the Intellectual Property Code, concerning the resale right, and in the French General Tax Code, concerning the VAT reduced rate. So we have two economic applications, and that have given rise to the definition of what is an original artwork. I will not go into the details of these provisions and their modification over time, because it would take us into another discussion. But to sum up, French provisions have established two criteria defining what is an original bronze cast. The first one is based on the number of copies, and we have very similar provision, very close to the Spanish provision, legal provisions, because we have a first criteria based on the number of copies that request a limited edition of 12, that is 8 plus 4 artist proofs. And the second one is based on the responsibility of the artist in the creation process. That is, the work must have been realized under the artist's responsibility or under the artist's control to be considered as an original. This seems clear, and this could have been simple, but it's not. Because a difference has been introduced between the provision on the resale right and the provision of the General Tax Code. And the difference concerns the second criteria. To put it simply, before the transposition into French law in 2006 of the European Directive on the Resale Right, dated 2001, the definition given to original cast included the limited edition of 12 and the copies made under the artist's responsibility and his or her heirs' responsibility. So clearly, the posthumous cast could be considered as original. But when the provision on the resale right have been introduced into French law, further to the implementation of this European directive, the reference to the artist heirs disappeared. So we have now some provision very clear on the resale right that only include posthumous cast made under a limited, that provides, the provision on the resale rights provide that the cast made in a limited edition of 12 and made under the artist's responsibility are original, so that posthumous cast cannot be considered as original. But if we apply the General Tax Code provision and other texts referring to the General Tax Code, then the mention of the responsibility of the heirs of the artist is present, so that we can consider as originals posthumous cast. So this shows how complex this issue of originality for posthumous cast is, and how it is difficult to set out clear rules. Therefore, and because we cannot find a clear and definite answer in the existing legal provisions, it is interesting to go back to the decisions that have been rendered by a French jurisdiction, and more particularly the decision rendered in the case of Lavague. In the decision, I think I've already talked about these. In the decision of Lavague, it is very interesting because the court analyzed the notion of originality for multiples by returning to the core of what is French copyright law. That is the imprint of the artist's personality. The definition of originality given in Lavague is not entirely based on the two material criteria of the limited edition and the degree of intervention of the artist. A more subjective approach has been taken by the court, and that is based on the research of the artist's intention. In this particular case of Lavague, the court reminds that an original artwork must reflect the personality of the artist, the willingness of the artist. This criteria is very fundamental under French copyright provisions, because it is because a work reflects the artist's personality or express the imprint of the author's personality that it will benefit from the protection of authorship's rights. The court therefore applied this principle, this idea of the reflection, the expression of the artist's personality, to multiples, to consider that an artwork, even made of multiples, must above all reflect the artist's personality and intention. And the court therefore stated that a work obtained from a surmoulage does not intimately reflect the author's personality, because only the original work reflects such intention. Because a surmoulage is a reproduction which does not reflect the artist's intention or personality, it cannot be presented as an original. In the case of Lavague, the court confirmed a position that had been previously adopted in various other decisions, and notably concerning posthumous cats of Rodin, according to which can only be originals the copies made in a limited number. We always have these criteria, but the copies made from the plaster or terracotta made by the artist personally, because only these copies coming from the plaster made by the artist can actually express the artist's intent. So by analogy, we could be tempted to conclude that a posthumous cast not obtained from a surmoulage, but obtained from a plaster or terracotta of the artist, could be considered as an original because it reflects the intention of the artist. When the artist made the plaster or made the terracotta, he intended to cast a bronze. And so this is the criterion retained that has been used by the court. So clearly, before the transposition of the European directive, the answer was clearly positive. It is after the transposition of the European directive that the situation has changed. The application on the resale right seems to leave no doubt. A posthumous cast cannot be considered as an original because it's not made under the artist's control. But if we can wonder what would be the position of French jurisdiction in a case where the resale right would not be questioned. The answer could be completely different, notably based on the position adopted by the Supreme Court in the case of Lavague, which really emphasized the intent of the artist. Let's imagine an artist who would have left very clear instructions to his heirs, first as to his or her intent to have posthumous cast from such and such original plasters or terracotta. Let's imagine that the same artist would have left very clear instructions to his or her heirs concerning the patina, the chiseling, or whatever may concern the cast. Would this cast be considered by French jurisdiction as a reproduction or as an original? We cannot deny the negative impact in terms of value on the market of the term reproduction. And we can also wonder, in such a case, whether the intent of the artist has not been respected. Therefore, looking for a safe art market, we will regret any uncertainty coming from the legal provisions. But looking for an art market as much close as possible from the artist's intent, as much respectful as possible of the artist's practice, we could encourage more flexibility and an case-by-case analysis. Thank you.
Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I'm very excited to be part of this conference, and thank you all for coming and joining the discussion. Alexandra Archipenko was a prolific artist. The Catalogue Raisonné currently records over 400 sculptures, which translates into almost 1,800 individual works, unique and editions. I was stuck on the versions. Unique and editions in a variety of material, including bronze. It lists posthumous casts if they fulfill specific criteria. The artist declared an edition for the artwork, and the sculptures were cast under the authority of his estate. By following this protocol, it is our intent to create a clear frame of reference. Our research and cataloging were shaped by the artist's practice, and as a result, our database grew organically, and we built a web-based interface to visually present the underlying structures of Archipenko's production. My paper will give a brief overview of Archipenko's practice, his thoughts on sculptural production, and how we fit this into our catalogue. In 1920, Archipenko exhibited at the Russian Pavilion at the prestigious Venice Biennale. The Ukrainian-born artist was 33 years old at that time. He had been living in Paris since 1909 and had established himself as a progressive artist among the international historic avant-garde. When he received the invitation to exhibit in Venice, he wrote a postcard to Herbert Walden, the founding director of the seminal Der Sturm organization in Berlin, and this is my translation. Archipenko wrote, "I am using the occasion to realize this important exhibition of my works, and I am shipping almost everything I have left." And here we have an installation view from the 1920 Venice Biennale. And he sent sculptures in different media, including plaster, terracotta, cement, wood, mixed media, and bronze. And to be specific, he sent 6 bronze casts. And the inclusion of these bronze casts in this important exhibition marked a significant change in his artistic practice. They were among the first bronzes that the sculptor had fabricated. As model for the casts, he used smaller works, figurative abstractions ranging from a height of 16 to 57 centimeters. And there's a second installation view, and you can see some of them are on those pedestals along the wall. Some of you might recognize one of his signature pieces, the flat torso, the first bronze cast that we know of a flat torso. Archipenko certainly was no stranger to the ideas of reproductions and editions. I'm showing you here an excerpt from a German catalogue from a Der Sturm exhibition in Berlin in 1913, and it listed the material of the exhibited works, but it also indicated that they could be ordered in other media as well. If you look, for example, at number 7, sits in the swipe, which translates from German to seated woman. It was exhibited in a terracotta, but if you wanted to, he would produce one for you either in marble or in bronze. Moreover, while Archipenko's sculptural practice included creating unique works, it also incorporated working in multiples. He first realized many of his sculptures in plaster, but also in clay, cement, cast stone, and artificial stone, a practice that was common before the First World War. These works were often cast from a mold and allowed for making more than one example. This work, Repose, for instance, was realized in at least 3 plaster copies, as well as in terracotta, before it was later executed in marble and bronze as well. Like other progressive sculptors during the pre-war years, Archipenko exhibited the plaster that stood at the beginning of a reproductive process as a finished work. He often experimented with color by tinting the plaster or by painting it. I'm showing you here 2 examples that are in New York. On the left, you see Carousel Pierrot, which is a unique work, and on the right, you see the plaster of Maternité, which is now in the collection of MoMA. Maternité, this plaster actually was used for the bronze edition. To address his complex artistic concerns, he also experimented with mixed media. So you see 2 constructions here, Medrano and Woman Before the Mirror. Both of them have been destroyed. Ordinary non-art materials were of interest because of anti-academy and anti-bourgeois connotations. In these constructions, he shared preferences for a modern style and materiality with other artists, including the Italian futurists. As mentioned, Archipenko fabricated only a few bronzes until 1920, which has been mainly explained by the lack of financial resources. I would like to suggest, though, that this practice might be rooted too in the artist's alliance with avant-garde thought and a call for modern materiality that was expressed so strongly in Umberto Boccioni's technical manifesto of futurist sculpture of April 1912. Here, the Italian rejected traditional sculpture materials. Archipenko was in active cultural exchange with the futurists, and the Italians celebrated his sculptures. The underlying socio-historical conditions of the artist's decision to include bronze casts in the prestigious and much politicized post-war Biennale in Italy still require further investigation. Yet, these bronze casts represent a visible shift in his practice. Archipenko continued producing bronzes, in particular after relocating to Germany in 1921, where he worked with foundries in Berlin and Frankfurt. A large touring exhibition through Germany in 1922 included 18 bronze casts, and here we have an installation view. There was audience demand, and Archipenko sold several casts to museums as well as private collections. When he immigrated to the United States in 1923, he brought the European casts with him and exhibited them the following year here in New York. 2 years later, after securing a new supporter and promoter, Archipenko began casting in bronze in the United States. And I found this wonderful portrait in our archives. It shows him at his desk in his New York studio. And you can see on the left 2 examples of the first bronzes cast in America. Diana all the way on the left, and then onward these 2 bronzes. When his next exhibition opened in 1927 in Denver, it included no less than 29 bronze sculptures. Several of these bronzes incorporated newly accessible techniques and materials such as chrome and nickel plating. During the 30s and 40s, he continued casting of select works, especially of the signature female torsos. But in those 2 decades, his practice shifted anew, and he focused foremost on working in clay. He realized over 70 new sculptures in this material, and he refined ceramic as a sculptural medium by finding complex ways of treating its surface. It was another exhibition that marked a shift. In 1935, Alfred Barr sent an invitation for Archipenko to participate in the now famous Cubism and Modern Art exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. With the requested sculptures being unavailable, they had been sold or stored in Europe, Archipenko made new versions from memory and from photographs. Boxing is an example of this group of works. The first version of boxing is what we're seeing here, is a plaster painted black, and it was exhibited at the 1914 Salon des Indépendants in Paris, where it was sold. After the sale, Archipenko made a second copy in plaster from the same mold, and this example was stored with friends before he left for the United States. So when Barr requested boxing for the MoMA exhibition, it was not accessible. And Archipenko recreated it in terracotta. This is the second version. It's now at the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice. And it is overall larger and 15.6 centimeter higher than the 2 known examples of the first version. It is also inscribed and dated differently. Out of this group of second versions grew a decade-long controversial correspondence between Barr and Archipenko. The letters give us insight into the artist's thoughts on sculptural reproduction. In a letter of February 1936 to Alfred Barr, the artist suggests that the works, the second versions, were originals because they were, and I'm quoting, sculpted individually and not reproduced from a mold. The originality he refers to here is in the process of making the sculpture. Later, Archipenko further described his position on these versions, and I'm reading it for you. Sometimes I sculpt a new version of the same statue after a considerable time has elapsed. Of course, in modeling the same problem, the forms are not as mathematically exact as if they were cast from the same mold. However, in all versions, I prefer to keep the date of the first, since I want to conserve the chronology of idea. The particular stylistic and creative approach I use equally in all versions unless changes are purposely made. While it is significant to hear the artist describe his thoughts on reproduction and dating, the statement introduces another category that we needed to incorporate into our cataloging: versions and also enlargements. What is little known is that Archipenko began casting the majority of his bronzes relatively late in his career during the 1950s. When he began working with Pearl's galleries in New York, he engaged in a business relation that encouraged and afforded him to make bronze editions. At that time, too, the early plaster and terracotta sculptures that Archipenko had stored in Europe before his emigration and had believed lost were recovered and returned to him. Archipenko decided to issue bronze editions of these important early works. And this group of returns included, for example, the second plaster copy of Boxing in the original version of 1914. Archipenko used it as model for the bronze edition, and he made the first bronze cast of Boxing in 1961. He passed away only 3 years later, in 1964, leaving this edition and many others incomplete. Archipenko's estate completed most of these editions. And this is an example of a posthumous cast, which is also now in MoMA's collection. These posthumous bronzes were cast from the original models created by the artist. Many posthumous casts were made at the same foundry and actually finished by the same workmen Archipenko had collaborated with. Generally, however, their art market price is lower. Since 2005, casting of the posthumous bronzes has been carried out under the auspices of the Archipenko Foundation. The foundation is lending the posthumous casts to exhibitions, and they are also given on long-term loan to museums. And select sales of these casts help to fund the foundation's programs, including the forthcoming sculpture Catalogue Raisonné. Archipenko was a prolific artist, and his production parameters were complex and not always consistent. Actually, it's been really, really difficult to sort out which bronze cast came from which version when I started the cataloging. I'm presenting you a very nice linear narrative, but it took many, many, many years to come to this point to state it so clearly. And in the bronze editions of the lifetime cast, for example, the markings and numbers are rarely sequential. A single edition can include unnumbered casts, casts with single digits, and casts that have a fractional. And there are inconsistencies with the markings of the posthumous casts as well. I'm showing you here our cataloging for Boxing for the first version, and we currently record 9 examples in the edition, 2 plasters made by the artist, and 11. We count 11 examples in the edition. 2 plasters made by the artist and 9 bronze casts. However, when we look at how those bronzes are actually numbered, you can see we have a cast 1/6. So he started out with the intent of having 6. The next cast, lifetime, same year, cast the same year, cast 2/8. So something happened there. Then we have a cast 3/8. Now we have no 4/8, but we have 2 5/8s. And then we have 3 examples that are marked 7/8, and we have a cast marked A. So that's what we have. And it's clear to me, having worked with this material for so long, that the artist and his estate did not wish at all to deceive or to make life difficult, but rather little attention was paid to the actual numbering of those casts. The Catalogue Raisonné has become a priority because we understand how important it is to explain the artist's processes of production and to create more transparency. Without the Catalogue Raisonné, our expert knowledge, it is currently very difficult to determine when an Archipenko bronze was produced and which edition it might come from. I'm showing you an example here of standing woman, and the bronze is inscribed Archipenko 1920. It's signed and dated 1920, which might lead you to believe, of course, that it was fabricated in 1920. This is actually a second version that the artist realized in 1960 after an original version from 1920. And for our cataloging and labeling, we've adopted the standard in the dating, as you see here, 1920/1960. So the first date is the date of conception, the second date is the date the second version was realized. And then we also include when it was actually cast. So here we have 3 dates, 1920, 1960, cast circa 1962. And I wanted to show you the first version was a unique work, a sculptor painting, and then in 1960 he created the second version, a plaster, and the bronze edition was realized from the plaster. And I have another slide just showing you an example of a posthumous bronze with the actual inscription on the bronze. And you can see, and that's the same in the lifetime cast, the inscription Archipenko 1920 variant. So he indicated himself in this example that it was a variant. He used the term variant or version. We choose the term version. Archipenko could not complete the bronze edition in this work that he started, and the estate and then subsequently the foundation completed it posthumously. This is a screenshot of our database, and I would like a tiny part of our database, and I would like to mention that while cataloging, we naturally have become more and more engaged with details and finding ways to record and fine-tune our data. One particular area that has been crucial is foundry documentation, which has been difficult to evaluate for many reasons. We ended up building and revising our database with more and more fields, recording invoice numbers, invoice dates, job numbers, order numbers, delivery dates, prices, etc. Even with all these details, it sometimes remains impossible to clearly document the casting foundry or to pin a casting date or patina date onto a specific cast. And I'm sharing here a glimpse at the beta version of our forthcoming sculpture Catalogue Raisonné. And you can see we have all the usual categories, work number, CR number, title, bronze, dimensions, cast number, inscription, etc. And I wanted to direct your attention to the second area there where it says cast details. So when we know, we do indicate the foundry, we do indicate the casting year. And in this example, you see research pending. So when we indicate research pending on the surface of the CR, there are often many, many details recorded at the back end. And we are just waiting for just one more puzzle piece to be able to move forward. That's the reality of our cataloging. And I would like to end with suggesting that Archipenko was certainly not the only modern sculptor to produce in such a complex way. Artists have their own individual approaches to sculptural production, and this can be explained by taking into account a specific historical and sociological context. In sculptural fabrication, general rules and standards for production and reproduction should of course apply, as for example the guidelines that were published over 40 years ago by the College Art Association. But the values and meanings of works, including editions and versions, might only be determined within a specific context that is explained and made available to the public. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. Alexandra Keiser, thank you very much. I think it was appropriate to end on your talk because it shows the work of a Catalogue, Raisonné, and a foundation to clearly delineate what is posthumous and what is lifetime. And it strikes me in contrast to the topics of the other two speakers, whereas the laws, it seems, serve to blur that very stark distinction between life and death. So who are the laws actually serving here? I'm wondering if either one of you could address that.
I don't know. I think in the case of Camille Claudel, but it's particular because it's not the law; it's the interpretation of the law given by the judges. But I think in the case of Camille Claudel, if we keep the criteria of the artist's intention, then the judges try to serve the artist. But sometimes, if we, on another side, if we look at the legal provisions and what the legal provisions we have in France, as I said, have been established for commercial concerns, so they define rules for the application of the resale right or some reduced tax rate, and so that I think that in this case the intent is to serve the art market.
I'd like to pick up on what you said, Liz, at the beginning, whose interest is served. And it was framed in this, as I heard it, in monetary terms largely. So I would like to ask, actually, what is the public interest and who serves that public interest, and how do the creation of posthumous casts, and I think Alexandra mentioned the placement in museums and exhibitions, and yesterday the discussion of Michelangelo and the proliferation of casts. And is there a very real public interest in having more out there in the public available to be seen?
I can answer. Yeah, I can start. Yes, I think that in the dissemination of those casts and placing them especially in select collections where we know, certain geographical area, there's no Archipenko. Certainly it makes the work more accessible, right? And it introduces, in the case of Archipenko, an important historic artist who now is just waiting to be rediscovered, and it gives him a place in the public and it opens what we really like to is it opens up new discussions. It introduces the work to a whole new generation of people and artists, and we always welcome any feedback that we get through this process.
But I just want to thank our panelists very much for this discussion.